Yeah, I think there has been, a trust that has grown. There's an initial trust from their side to bring us in and to include us with their kids. And then I think when they see how much it means to us that and what we can bring, because I really think that there's an element of what uncles and aunts bring to kids as well. I think when they see, a bit of what we can bring in sometimes in our limited capacity, that that trust just grows.
Welcome to The Full Stop, a podcast for the childless not by choice, their cheerleaders and allies. The Full Stop podcast is hosted by Sarah Lawrence, Berenleith Howard-Smith, and me, Michael Hughes. And we explore themes that make up the childless identity, and then we hope with all our guests you'll find information, inspiration, and if appropriate, your space in the childless community. Now please remember that the thoughts expressed by our guests are their own and not necessarily those of the podcast hosts. We had a lot of feedback on this topic over our social media, and we are really pleased to introduce 2 new male voices to our episode list. And this month we are exploring what some describe as a bittersweet experience, being childless aunts, uncles and godparents. So let's meet Ben and John.
Hello to our listeners. We're going to be talking today about something that doesn't often get talked about, if at all. Correct me if I'm wrong, any of you. But we're going to talk about what it's like to be a childless aunt, uncle, godparent, or in any way, I guess, connected to children. It's something that we do sort of quietly in the background, and we've been asked to do this episode by the community. So we've got a couple of new voices, which actually we're always excited about. So you're going to be meeting Ben and John, and we'll get them to introduce themselves shortly. But we wanted to do this chat because obviously, as I say, it's not something we talk about. Some of us are aunts, uncles, godparents, some of us aren't. And I think it's sometimes interesting to share our experiences because it can be very different for all of us. I personally am an aunt. I've got 2 nephews and a niece, and it's been an interesting journey based on where I am in my own grief. So I think this could be interesting because I'm talking to Ben already. I think you said you caveat, don't you? This is where I am now, but I'm on a journey and I recognise that. So enough of my waffling. John, Ben, would you be okay to introduce yourselves to our listeners? Who would like to go first?
Yeah, I'm very happy to. I have to go first so the name sequence makes sense. My name's John. Yeah, I'm an uncle to 8 nieces and nephews, effectively referred to as nibblings. And that's probably because I'm one of 6 children. So, yeah, I've got 5 siblings and from that has come 8 nibblings. They range in age from 21 down to 2. So a real kind of like wide spectrum of ages. But I guess that also means I've sort of been on this uncle journey for quite a while now and will do for a while to come. So I live in South East London. I sort of grew up here and most of my family are based around sort of London and the South East, although I do have one younger sibling who's up in Sheffield now in the sort of north of England.
Thanks, John.
And I'm Ben. Really good to be here today. Based just south of Sydney, but you can probably tell from the accent that I wasn't raised in Australia. I came to Australia from London about just over 11 years ago, and that was after the IVF journey that my wife and I had been on, and there was a pivot for us at that time. I'm uncle to a few nephews and nieces, and I'm also officially a godparent to a few children. Very good friends of ours based in the UK and overseas as well. And also just that I've been fortunate to be, included, in other families that have kind of adopted us, into becoming sort of surrogate aunts and uncles into their families as well. I'm married to Jo. We've just celebrated 24 years of marriage yesterday. So, it's been a bit of a journey for us. My caveat, Sarah and everybody, is, and I generally say this whenever I'm starting a conversation with somebody these days, is this is my belief at the moment, but that is very susceptible to change. I'm always sort of testing, what I believe in and just, I'm on a journey. So, and I think this whole thing for me has been a journey too.
Yeah. How have you found it? How have you found being uncle, godparents? How did you find it initially and how do you find it now? Have things changed for you?
I think things have definitely changed for me over the sort of period, of being in this role. I think I always had a lot of enthusiasm about sort of eventually being a parent and that kind of stuff, and saw this as real like fertile ground for kind of developing their skills, but also kind of wanting to have a sort of very active relationship with these sort of new family members or godchildren as well. Definitely wanted to be kind of very present in those roles and not just be there by name or sort of by happenstance, but be very deliberate about how I sort of cultivate those relationships and invest in those children's lives. And I think what's been quite interesting and maybe a little bit challenging for me is sort of recognising over time, and in fact, like fairly recently, sort of in the last sort of 2 years, how actually those spaces and those relationships can increasingly be a source of pain and upset and triggers for thoughts and feelings that are difficult and painful. And so I think I've had to perhaps be a bit kinder to myself in how I manage those relationships and the sort of extent to which I'm involved. Again, wanting to sort of relationships to be of high quality, but actually for that reason, having to go about them a slightly different way.
Yeah, I think for me, it's been a positive experience mostly. When Joe and I were going through our IVF journey, we had some good friends around us with their children. Good friends were slightly older and, we became part of their family, so even whilst we were going through that, we felt like we were adopted into a different family outside of our blood families. And that gave us a sense that there are alternative forms of family and not just your own family at the time. Obviously, it was a very challenging journey to go through, but I think that gave us some hope that, there's different models of family to look at after we weren't successful. And then you do, I remember, hearing the news, I think it's when you hear news of, your friends having kids or, your siblings having kids, that there's a challenge around that. Initially, it's a call out of the blue and then, hopefully you're together and you can support each other through that. But for us, the predominant feeling after the shock was we want to be involved. We want to jump in, and we felt incredibly privileged to be named godparents. For the kids that we were officially godparents to. And generally, we've taken that pretty seriously. My wife is so much better at remembering birthdays and keeping in contact at long distance. I think one of the challenges for us is most of those are not in Australia, so we have to sort of maintain the relationships long distance. Whereas I tend to be somebody that is really fully engaged when I'm in the same place with that person. But I think overall, I would really miss not having that interaction with children if I wasn't a godparent or I wasn't an uncle. And it gives me the chance. I think I've had to learn this over the years, but it's given me the chance to play with the kids. I'm naturally playful anyway, and I love sort of, jumping in with the kids and playing with them. Reading bedtime stories is something which, it's so special to me and to Joe, but I'd probably do more of it. That we take photos and we send memories, we create the memories over the years of us reading bedtime stories. And it's something we look back on those photos and just think, okay, we've come a long way with those children as they've grown up. And in fact, one of the families that surrounded us when we were going through the journey initially, one of their kids is now late 20s and about to have her own daughter, so it's almost like, we've gone the whole journey with that child. Yeah, so I think it's there's challenges along the way. I think the grief is something which, that doesn't go away, but it's I would describe, it's probably getting into a slightly different area, but I would describe my grief as like a mature grief. And that's not to say I'm mature in myself in how I've dealt with it, but I think it has matured over the years, so I don't live with it every day. But there's times when I choose to revisit it, and there's other times when it kind of just catches me off guard, And I think there's also things which, as part of that, we've had to make decisions on what we do with kids and what we don't do with kids. But that's been a journey, and that's, I guess, part of the maturing into the role as well.
I so resonate with all of what you've both said there. So being an on, I'm not a godparent, but I'm an on, and there's been things that I've really struggled with. Storytelling, I could not do that. That's not something I'd be able to feel comfortable doing. But there have been times that I guess my grief, that maturity, it's kind of moving away, I think. But my niece and nephew on my brother's side they're getting older and they're a lot more easier to handle because they're now moody teenagers. So it's just like a balm to the soul, isn't it, when they're being little shits. And you think, oh, yes, I'm all right with this. But when they're smaller, I think I really struggled with my grief as well. And I wasn't sure of what my place was, because we don't get a handbook, do we, in terms of what is okay to do and what isn't okay to do. Do you know what I mean? How involved can I be? What role can I take? Should I be doing this? Shouldn't I be doing this? And I remember the first time I took my niece out, I thought I'd broken her. I don't know how she did it, but she was stood still. I turned round to get a lunchbox and she'd fallen over and there was blood everywhere. I remember I was just like, shit, what do I do? What do I do? And I remember just driving to my mum and dad's at full speed to go and put her back together again. And it was just that feeling of, how do I cover this off with my brother? How do I admit that I've made a mistake? And I have found it so difficult to navigate as a childless person, because that I find it quite awkward to be around children. I just have an innate awkwardness of what should I or should I not be doing. But it sounds to me as though you've both navigated that awkwardness. Did you have an awkwardness, or do you resonate with that, or is it something that has disappeared?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm still navigating it. I feel like I'm better than I used to be, but I've also been incredibly fortunate to have good friends that have basically asked us to not to parent their children alongside them, but when we're with them to basically say, act as parents as well. We've been with friends when, the kids have been sent up to bed, been put down to bed upstairs, and we've been downstairs having a meal, with our friends. The kids come downstairs being naughty, etc. And I've been told to go take them up and settle them, put them back to bed, and not to be too stern, but to kind of tell them that they need to stay there, So it gave me an opportunity to feel a little bit like what it would be like to be a parent. Or other times, I've been allowed to play rough and tumble, with the kids, when sometimes you feel, particularly with new friends, like, I don't know quite how far to go with this. I would certainly be a natural rough and tumble parent if I had been. You don't quite know when it's not your kid. You don't want to break them, like you say. But I feel like I've been incredibly fortunate like that. There have been other times when, and this is one of the things which Joe and I have decided that we won't do going forward, is to go to the children's birthday parties, where they have, all of their school friends and the parents of the school friends standing around, and we're the only ones there without a child. It just feels like there's a club which we don't fit into, and that feels incredibly awkward. We're really good friends with the family that we know, but we don't know any of the other parents around. You sense that there's a little bit of questioning. Why are you here? If you don't have kids, what's your purpose here? Apart from maybe clearing up and handing out the food, but you just feel like a bit of a spare end,
I think it's really interesting you highlight that as one particular sort of environment, Ben, because I've definitely felt that very acutely kind of in that space, and maybe even more so like as a single man, like I feel even more kind of visible or sticking out in that space. I think I've had it, two memories that really come to mind, once with my godchild, and then once with one of my nephews when I was up in Sheffield when they were having a party. And that second time around with my nephew, I similarly thought this isn't the ideal space kind of to be in. I perhaps haven't really been as conscious of that until you sort of raised that but I totally agree with that. Going back to your question, Sarah, about, was there ever any kind of like awkwardness or anything? I think I was very lucky in that had sort of been involved in sort of running kind of kids clubs and things, sort of like helping out with kids clubs and things as a sort of teenager. When I was in school, sort of at the end of secondary school, sort of age 17, 18, I did some volunteer placements in a primary school, and then went to work in a primary school. So I think I had a lot of just experience kind of working with children in kind of other contexts. So I think that actually made me feel fine when it came to sort of meeting godchildren or nieces and nephews. And I guess, in fact, I felt like, I feel really well equipped for this, and I've got a kind of a skill set or a knowledge base I can draw on. Now, obviously, it's then a bit of a learning curve, because sort of like Ben said, you find yourselves in contexts and situations which you would never be in sort of professionally. So yeah, there's definitely a real enrichment to those things. But I always felt like, no, I've got a skill set and a frame of reference I can kind of draw on to get that initial kind of relationship building going.
I love that. I did some work experience with kids. I loved it. I just basically turned into a big kid. It was brilliant. But I think what I found was I had a role. It was kind of like, oh, you're Sarah, the teaching assistant, if you like. Whereas with this, I don't know how you both found this, but I think it's that lack of what role am I supposed to be in? And you put it really nicely, Ben, when you said the other parents, like, well, who are you? Why are you here? What is your role other than handing out cake? And I think that's the bit I personally have struggled with. So early doors, I said I wouldn't do birthdays, not because I wanted to hurt people, but for me, I don't do an awful lot of noise. When there's, you know, when kids do that really high-pitched scream that goes straight through your head and you think, Christ, I don't think I'm ever going to hear again. I can't do a lot of that. So early doors, I was quite honest with my brother and said, listen, I know it's probably going to be a bit painful, but I'm not going to be able to do these things. And my brother's been really good at accepting what I can do and what I can't. And early doors with my grief as well, it's kind of like you know, if I took the kids out, he thought that was a big deal. He tried not to make too big a deal of it, because then I would have been like, no, I'm not taking them out because you're making too big a fuss. But it was being around those other parents that I think I really struggled with. It's kind of like, what's my identity in all of this?
It sounds like there's a lot of trust there with the friends you have and with your siblings as well, that that relationship must be very different to what it was before they were parents. But in doing so, it sounds very much that you've all got a trust with your siblings and the people, that the families that have supported you along the way. Is that
certainly for me? Yeah, certainly for me. I think it's we have wanted. I guess some of it comes from just being open on our journey, and I'm generally, you know, people ask me, you know, these days, you know, why did you come to Australia? And, you know, somebody I'm meeting new, and I've always been open. I said, yeah, my wife and I went through an IVF journey that didn't work out, and we decided that we wanted to do something different with our lives. You know, and we've always had that openness. So when we've had good friends around us at the time, or people that have, you know, seen us on our journey, then we've included them into our journey, and therefore they've included us into their families. Yeah, I think there has been, you know, a trust that has grown. There's an initial trust from their side to bring us in and to include us with their kids. And then I think when they see how much it means to us, that and what we can bring, because I really think that there's an element of what uncles and aunts bring to kids as well. I think when they see, you know, a bit of what we can bring in sometimes in our limited capacity, that that trust just grows, you know, like I said before, Joe's much better at remembering birthdays and keeping in contact long distance. But I think that's a really important part of it. Yeah. And then, you know, there's a sense that Joe does that side of things and I do the play side of things when we're actually, you know, with the kids, which is my forte, I guess. But yeah, it's definitely something that has grown, the trust over the years.
Yeah, I think similarly. And perhaps, again, it was helpful having had a bit of sort of a professional reference point that sort of gave some credibility to working with kids, even like simple things like paediatric first aid courses, that kind of thing. Like, it's a bit of a reassurance. But it's certainly, it's been a sort of a growing and a developing. And I think you just naturally, through those relationships, and Ben, I've been really struck with the way you've spoken about sort of some of these like friends that have been raising children and drawn you and Joe into that, like, just through those kind of natural interactions, there's the opportunity to quite naturally kind of mentally do a bit more each time, or take a bit of responsibility, or, oh, yeah, we're all hanging out and they want to sort of pop to the shops or something. And they're like, oh, you're right, for their 5 minutes on your own. You're like, yeah, of course. So I think that often these things can happen sort of quite naturally. I think something that came to mind when you said that was about 2 years ago, my oldest brother, his wife has bipolar, and she had an episode that required sort of hospitalisation, and the sort of short periods before that can be quite sort of traumatic and difficult. And he was then in the position of sort of being a single parent, sort of for the first time in sort of 6 years. to their son, and I sort of ended up basically sort of moving in with them to kind of try and be as supportive as possible. And I think, obviously, that was perhaps quite unusual circumstances to sort of find ourselves in, but almost by necessity, it kind of then trusted me to perhaps take on more of a role and have more responsibility. And I think what's quite nice is since then there have been much more opportunities where they're sort of going away either for the evening or for the weekend, and will sort of ask me to come and sort of look after their son. And I think perhaps, those prior experiences kind of give the opportunity to show your, trustworthiness, but also that child's comfortability with kind of this person as a sort of potential kind of caregiver. And I think that's also an important voice, is the child's kind of saying, well, how do they relate to this adult in your life, and that kind of thing. And I think, that's also kind of worked well. It sounds silly to say, but as I said, I'm one of 6 kids, so all of my nibblings have multiple aunts and uncles, and they always roll their eyes if they say that their favourite uncle is sort of Uncle John, and they're like, oh yeah, of course it is, kind of thing. But I think, I just think that the opinion of the child often can sort of help inform some of these decisions and that kind of thing. So, I think you're right, that trust sort of does grow and develop. I think, if I'm being honest, I think perhaps part of my sort of childlessness journey, I've sort of thought, perhaps I could take a much more active role kind of in some of the lives, particularly of my nibblings. But my godchildren are a bit further away geographically. And although there have been sort of those occasions I've sort of mentioned there, I sometimes think, have I missed a trick? Could I have actually been very deliberate in terms of being more involved, or perhaps sort of saying, why don't I look after them for the weekend and you guys can go away, have some rare time to yourself, or that kind of thing. And I perhaps often would imagine those scenarios and think, that would feel really sort of worthwhile and kind of a nice thing to be able to give to my siblings and that kind of thing. And perhaps sometimes feel a bit sad that hasn't played out in that way. Maybe I could still do that. I'm seeing them this lunchtime, so I'll ask them if they still want that option or not.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one to me, because I'm not an aunt. So I have unofficial kind of vague sort of godparenty distant sort of thing with a really good friend of mine who I was pregnant at the same time as her, but I miscarried. That was before I knew I was childless, and before IVF. So I was one of the first people at the hospital when she was born, because she was so far away from her parents, they couldn't get to her so easily. And so for me, it's interesting. This is very interesting listening to this, because it's an area that I don't know and I haven't experienced. And unlike perhaps your experiences, Ben, I've kind of, when I went through IVF, I distanced myself from everybody. I literally just the barricades went up, and I didn't have that experience, I guess, of perhaps talking to people more about that. I became very, very, very quiet, and I really struggled with other people's opinions, which is kind of why the whole birthdays thing is interesting, because as you say, sometimes it's not necessarily kids perhaps, and it's not it sounds like it's not your siblings, but it can be other people in the periphery who kind of make you feel different, it sounds. And I've certainly noticed that with friends of mine who don't quite get maybe the relationship that I've had with my unofficial goddaughters. But why is this? And I'm not officially a godparent because they're not particularly religious family. But it's just so complicated sometimes. And it's other people and how they respond, I think, to childlessness. And I'm just wondering if there's parents, because I know we have parents that listen to us. And I'm just thinking, if that person is listening and they've got children and they have someone, I would imagine they're listening because they know someone who is childless, then what's their best way into this relationship? If they want to have a better relationship with a childless person, thinking about that, how would they navigate that? Because I'm kind of struggling with this a little bit myself, not being an aunt, and I'm thinking how they might be feeling as well. What's the best kind of way to build that relationship up, do you think? Any words of advice for them?
For me, I think it would have to be, it's an organic relationship at the start. It's not that you go out looking for somebody, but I think it's if you're good friends and they've gone through a journey. I think there's been a part of our journey, and I totally understand what you were saying about, closing ranks, closing doors, going through IVF. it's such a difficult period. But the people who in our journey that we had open doors to were very select. And because of that, the bonds grew pretty strong. So there was a natural relationship there. And I think even those that we made friends with after, that part of the journey, they have come to know us. They've come to know the journey that we've been through. They've been introduced to that side of a journey, that not everybody just grows up and when they have kids, it's if, and even just reteaching some of the language around that. There's an understanding. So when we get invited to a party, there's a real understanding between us and the friends, and there's that depth there, but it's not visible. And you kind of forget. At least we did anyway. I kind of forgot, that you go into that setting. And just because those friends of ours, have that deep understanding of us and our journey, doesn't mean that everybody else has a deep understanding of, childlessness. There's an assumption on our part, maybe, that you walk in and everybody should have that level of awareness. But I think there's kind of like, there's sometimes that deep understanding between really good, depth of friendships. And then there's a level of awareness, in a social setting. And there's not much in between. It's like this great big gap, and part of the awkwardness is they don't know where you fit either, and you turn up without kids and nobody's explained, these are our good friends, Ben and Joe, and they're kind of like an uncle and aunt sort of figure. They don't have kids of their own. Nobody's explaining that. They're just looking around for, well, where are their kids? They're trying to match, who are they here with, So I think, I can't remember the question now. It's certainly, I think, yes. So I would say, the general sort of ask of people when I'm talking about awareness of this subject is, be open to other forms of family, and, where you have your own natural family, be open to inviting others in to experience that family as well. Because you will gain out of that. There's so much you will gain and your kids will gain from that. But also the people that you're inviting in, get an experience that they will possibly never have unless you do so.
Thank you.
Just on your final comment there, Ben, I think increasingly I've kind of thought about, obviously my nieces, nephews and godparents are all in sort of two-parent families, all in sort of heterosexual two-parent families. And so I've grown up in a very traditional family model. And I think sort of increasingly I've been aware of the value of like demonstrating something different in that child's life, that actually growing up doesn't automatically mean I'm going to meet someone and have kids and buy a house and all that kind of thing. Like showcasing that there are different ways of doing life, and often increasingly see that as something of value in their lives. And I think particularly where I've seen some of the older ones kind of come into the end of school and go into the next steps, feeling real pressure in terms of like, well, what's the right thing to do? Is this decision going to kind of impact the rest of my life? Just sort of, reassuring them and almost living out an example of, well, there's lots of different ways that life can turn out and happen, and some things you can plan for and some things you absolutely can't, and that there's an ability to be able to roll with that and draw on support and that kind of thing. I think the other thing that sort of came to mind just when you first posed that question, I think, is even giving people the opportunity to talk about their situation. And again, you don't want to assume that someone is happy to talk about their sort of childlessness situation or their journey, but even just sort of saying, I'd be really willing to have that, to hear part of your story, or to understand what's helpful for me in terms of, drawing you into our life or our family's life. Please let me know. If they say, I was listening to this podcast the other day and people were talking about X subject, it made me think of you, and I wonder what would be most helpful. I think just open up that conversation, and again, not then expecting them or requiring them to kind of necessarily share, but just opening that door and sort of saying, well, whenever you want to, let's keep having that conversation, or find out how this relationship and dynamic can kind of best work and best develop.
I really love that. I love all that observation that you both had there. If the topic in this episode chimes with you, you can get in touch with us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn and Blue Sky. We appreciate your feedback. Childless Not By Choice listeners can carry on the conversation with us in our safe space at the Full Stop online community. For more details on how to join and to claim a free month's trial on us, please visit www.thefullstoppod.com. We extend a huge thanks to the current members of our amazing online community, and it's because of them that we can keep the lights on for the podcast and look forward to giving back to the childless community as we grow. John, I love the idea of being a role model as well.
Yes.
Isn't that amazing? I hadn't thought of that, but yeah, it's quite right. It is that thing of we're all, family is such a diverse word. It's not necessarily, as you say, get married, have a house, have kids. It's so much more to it now. I know I've been open with the children that I do know, the few that I know, about my situation, so that I think they're aware that I did want to be a mother, that it wasn't just that I didn't, which was a myth that sort of abounded around my family because I drew up the drawbridge, as it were, and didn't really talk about it and didn't share that I'd been through IVF. And they thought that I just didn't want, which hurt a lot. I have to say, no disrespect to anyone listening who has chosen not to have children, but just that for me, wanting to be a mother and then being assumed I wasn't was really, really hard to hear, I have to say. But I think that idea of perhaps being a role model through sharing stories to children in our lives, I think is incredibly, quite empowering, actually. I hadn't thought of it in that way at all. But yeah, thank you. That's a really nice observation.
I really like that as well, John. Sorry, Michael.
So I've got a really good situation at the moment where we're looking after our nephew who's with us for about another 10 days and then he's back off to the UK. And I sat down with him today and said, look, I'm doing a podcast this evening about being an aunt and an uncle. So I've got some questions for you. And we had a really, and Vicky was there too, we had a really good conversation on the back deck here in the late afternoon. And that was one of the things that he actually highlighted was the role model. Because he said, one of the things that is really good about you and Vicky is that I just turn up and I just feel so comfortable with you guys because he said there's no expectation. And I said to him, do you think it's because we're not parents that we just accept you for who you are and we're not adulterated with our idea of what a kid could be? And we sort of come to an agreement that there's some truth in that. We just rock up as Vicky and Michael and Harry's there and Harry's Harry, and that's the way it works. But because we've talked about our childlessness quite a lot, he's drawn parallels with our level of empathy and our understanding and our inclusion because, we talk about this community and how diverse it is. And he's picking up on these things. And he said to us, it's really great to be with people that have these levels of inclusion and empathy. And so I don't think we should underestimate the effect that we as childless people can have on the young, because as Harry said to us today, he said he has learned a lot from us, and he really sees Vicky and I as great role models for him.
I love that, Michael. What a really lovely thing to actually have had a conversation about and to learn from. That's amazing. You must feel so proud.
I have to say, got a little bit. I could feel the emotions welling up. So I was close to a little tear, but it was really beautiful. But I just want to take you a step back now and give you a different perspective. Thanks, John. But I'm going to bring a little lightness to it. Some years ago, talking about bedtime reading, we went to Vicky's brother's place in Queensland, and his wife goes, "Why don't you go and read a book to Brody?" Okay, that's what uncles do. I'll go and do that. Now, unfortunately, I was in the realms of I'd been taking theatre acting lessons. So I thought, here we go, reading a book, I'll bung it right on. Let's just say it didn't come across very well because Uncle Michael scared Brody and Uncle Michael doesn't read bedtime stories anymore.
What was the story?
I got no idea. But I was, voices and different, and it didn't go down very well at all.
I bet Brody remembers it if you asked.
Scarred for life.
I'll have to ask him next time I see him. Scarred for life.
I've spoken to a therapist about it at some point.
It's kind of interesting because I am listening to all this and feeling a sense of kind of emotions because of the things that I won't experience. I have to say, it's interesting that I think in childlessness we can often universally relate to things and go, oh yeah, that thing, even if it's perhaps different for our experiences. But just on behalf of perhaps some of the listeners who are around who don't have that relationship, then if you're feeling and you're listening to this thinking, I wish, then I hear you, because I'm listening and thinking, I wish I had that relationship, because actually now that I've gone through IVF and on the other side and childlessness, I mean, for whatever reason that we have childlessness as a part of our lexicon, then I think that it's kind of a sense of mourning for what never was. Not in the sense of my brother not having children, and of course my parents are not grandparents in that, and that's another topic I think that pops up as well in the periphery of all of this childless aunt things. Is also the unusual, but happening cases of where I think parents don't become grandparents because of whatever situation their children are in. But I think it's that sense of sort of not perhaps trying hard enough, and John, just relating to what you were saying about not thinking about whether you could have your nieces or your nephews for a weekend or something like that, and that kind of like did I try hard enough? And for me, I think it's, did I try hard enough with my nieces and nephews by marriage? I kind of put a boundary up and went, that's my husband's problem. I didn't know them well enough. They were all kind of growing up. Well, they were kind of 7, I think the youngest was, when I came into the family. And now they're all grown up with kids of their own. So watching them grow up and have children, and I cannot. And then the fact that there's the boundary of marriage means that I don't see them necessarily as my family. So, and then in my own family, it's my cousins having children. So again, there's a distance there. And some of the things I think that happened at the time, this narrative of Berenice not liking children or not wanting to be a mum and being seen in a different way, I think was quite hard. So the distances and there were great big walls have gone up, and I've not dismantled them because it's been easier not to, because I've been so long without children in my life that I'm slightly terrified of them coming back in, because I'm like, what do I do? Because I've been so inexperienced. Yeah, actually, in my other life, away from the podcast, I've run workplace mentorship schemes. I've been and talked to teenagers about being a designer, about being in business. I do loads of stuff like that. So I've got some degree of qualification, not to the level perhaps that you have, John, but I've got some degree of like, I can do this. I can relate to children, and I don't kind of like completely upset and terrify them. But it's still that kind of level of kind of confidence, I think, as well, because there are walls around it. It's quite, as I say before, it was interesting to listen to this because it's not my lived experience, and I just wanted to just acknowledge that for people perhaps who are thinking, well, I'm not a childless aunt or an uncle and I'm coming into this and I don't relate to it. But actually from this, I'm beginning to see that maybe there's other opportunities to just test the waters with children in maybe different ways. Because I think the other thing I just wanted to just mention as well is that in the adoption process that I try to go through, a lot of that is you need to associate with children, building up that trust, which is why my other question came up earlier about trust, is having to trust in other people, your feelings and your experiences, and they don't share them, I think is incredibly courageous, I think, of both of you to bridge that gap. I think that I just want to acknowledge and bring that into the space as well. I think that's incredibly courageous of both of you, because my experience, I think that of a lot of our audience, is that we are often doing the hard work. And sometimes some parents just literally just stop at the bit and they are parents, and we have to kind of educate. And I have a consistent and persistent dislike of that, because there's so much stuff out there now that parents and other people can listen to and go, okay, this is what it might be like to be childless now. And this episode adds to that library, I think, of voices, which I think is why it's so important and why I'm learning so much from all of you talking about this. I think it's incredible that we're here doing this. But it is weird just thinking, I've got nothing. I don't have a point of reference, which is really destabilising, I have to say. It's not sort of where I sit with things. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm really enjoying the conversation. I did have another question, if it's all right to ask you. And it was just that, does being an uncle help you in terms of talking to your friends about this? Does being an uncle and building up and maybe having some relationship with your sibling and with nieces and nephews then help you to go out into the world and navigate children in other environments, perhaps?
Oh, that's a great question. I was also just reflecting on what you were saying, Berenice, and what John was saying earlier around, having professional relationships with children, and that giving you at least some sort of platform to build relationships with the nephews and nieces or godchildren, or when you're in those situations. And I think my wife came from a social work background, so she was very, very familiar and au fait with how to deal with kids, young kids all the way up to teenage years. Whereas I think because I've come from a technology background, I don't really have much interaction with kids in technology. And because I haven't had my own children, I haven't been learnt, as every new parent does, from the ground up, from baby up, to how to deal with children in the different ages and cycles. So coming fresh into a new family or a friendship with their kids, and maybe meeting them when they're toddlers or meeting them when they're 10 years old. How do you relate? With my wife's got this sort of framework of they're this years old, then they're probably they're into this sort of thing. And I just didn't have that frame of reference at all. So for me, I think I've had to learn a lot. But in that learning, it's given me the relationships I have with the families, with children, godchildren, with nephews and nieces. That's given me a better understanding of children now. One of the things I really struggled with at work in the early days was just around the assumptions of, you're meeting new people, or even at parties, the question that comes after the first one, which is what do you do, is how many kids do you have? And it's around that sort of sense of purpose. And I really struggled with that a lot in the early days. And I was open, I was told people my journey and everything, but I just didn't have any connection. Whereas now I feel like still don't like that assumption, but when people are talking about the kids that they've got and what they do on the weekends, I know where they're coming. Well, I don't know where they're coming from, but I have a sense of, something parallel in my life with being an uncle, or being a godparent, with being included in other families with kids. That I get a sense of, I know how to have a conversation with you. I know how to discuss, what kids are into. I know what, we gave, Rosie for, her birthday, her last birthday, and what she's into, that sort of thing. So I think it's helped me in those situations. It's helped my journey because I've had, those relationships.
I love that observation about what people maybe consider. I certainly found that when I've been doing things, if I mention my unofficial goddaughters, then people that I work with think that it's suddenly okay to talk about their kids. Because I've talked about that. It's like, it's okay now. So I literally get bombarded by their kids' stories, and they are terribly dull children. Sorry, they don't listen to the podcast. It's like it's permission suddenly is granted because Berenice mentioned unofficial goddaughter. And no, it's not. It isn't, because and it's just so hard to explain why it's not. Yeah, it's difficult. So yeah, thank you very much, Ben.
But I don't know how deliberate you have been in using this language, but you spoke about when sort of liaising with families with children. And I remember some very, very, very good friends of mine had a journey where they had to kind of manage sort of infertility in their sort of marriage, and another kind of good friends who are married couple as well. Sort of the sort of five of us kind of really sort of journeying through that together. And the couple that sort of hadn't had that infertility experience, I remember when they told me that they were sort of expecting their first child, and I made reference to the start of their family, and they challenged me on that, and they were like, it's not children that creates a family. They're like, we were already a family, and they're like, John, you're already a family. And I found that really impactful, and so I've been tried to be very deliberate in using that language for couples or single people, kind of referencing their family unit, as it were. And I found that really enlightening to sort of, again, not to just use assumed language or sort of, kind of the language of societal norms. And the use of family was, one that I found really important in my kind of learning. And Berenice, I can't actually remember your question, so I'm so sorry I haven't answered it. I don't know if you want to repeat it or we can move on.
It's fine. We can move on. I just love the rabbit holes that we're going down here, because I think it's just really interesting that there are, despite the fact that, not being an aunt and that you are aunts and uncles, there's actually some really good parallels there, I think, in terms of kind of that, the boundaries perhaps that we set or we don't set, and what other people think is right to comment on or otherwise as well. We've got quite a lot coming up in the chat, so we've got something from Instagram. So this is Elizabeth in the Lakes on Instagram. Thank you for sharing this. So I will mention the name because it's public on our Instagram feed. And she says, thank you for covering this topic. It's really important. When I was having treatment, all I wanted was to have children like my sister and sister-in-law. And I truly wanted to give my niece and nephews, the cousins, I felt they deserved someone to play with, to grow up with. And I felt duty bound. As I came to accept my childlessness, I realised that it wasn't my responsibility and that those children had each other and plenty of friends to make memories with. As an aunt who sees their cousins, as an adult who sees their cousins anyway, I realised I can be an auntie to those children 100% now, like a second mum, able to give advice, provide support, have fun, but without being the disciplinarian that you have to be when you're a parent. I love that I can spoil them. I'm sad for my sister and my husband's sister that they don't get to experience being aunties, and that's been hard to reconcile, but they get to be mums, don't they? Something I never get to do. So that was a really lovely observation, and I think a lot of that we've covered here today already, and I just think it's a really nice thing to bring into our conversation, that not having to be the disciplinarian, as you say, Ben, you get to do all like the rough and tumble as you want to, and put them to bed if they don't go to bed, those sorts of things as well. And Michael does the scary voices and frightens Brody. I think there's some interesting parallels there from what we've talked about, so thank you very much, Elizabeth, for that.
Question in the chat: where you have nieces and nephews at wide range of ages, have you found the relationship different depending on where they arrived in your childless journey? Have you any thoughts on that at all?
For me, certainly. And again, I think I feel a little bit of sort of guilt around this at times, in that I'm very conscious. I felt much more sort of enthusiastic and engaged with the kind of first few that sort of came along, because I think at that time I still perhaps assumed or thought or hoped that at some point I will sort of have my own kids. I think, as I sort of mentioned at the start, as I've sort of, been on the journey with my relationship with my childlessness and sort of recognising that's sort of my lot in life, finding therefore some of those family spaces a bit more difficult and challenging, I've had to sort of put different boundaries in, and I've recognised that I know therefore I'm not as involved with some of the younger children now. It's interesting. I've wanted to kind of be quite transparent with that with my siblings, but I've every time I've tried to raise my kind of experience and my processing of my childlessness, the conversation shuts down really quickly. I think they find it very difficult to kind of engage with and talk to me about that. So I haven't actually shared that observation with them, because I feel like it sits within a wider conversation that we haven't been able to have yet. But no, definitely an observation that's true in my case, in that question that was put up, that, I think I've drawn different boundaries over the last sort of 3 to 4 years, and that probably has impacted. I think I would say, again, and I know I spoke about this earlier, when we are together, I always try and provide that same like quality of relationship. But I think the frequency isn't there as it was with the others. I'm not sort of, seeking out to spend time with them as often, but because of, what it kind of like brings up in me.
John?
I think for me, I was just trying to think as you were talking, John. I don't know if it's so much my journey that's changed the relationships, when I've been introduced to the children where I'm at on my journey. I don't think that's so much. I think it's probably, for me, there have been certainly difficulties just geographically staying in contact. And there were some of the there's one nephew, there was a godchild who were born probably around just before or whilst we were going through the IVF journey, and that was harder, I think. I think if anything, it's probably to do with more my age. As I get older, and the relationships are changing as well. So I think, when I was in my mid-30s, when I was going through IVF, I was a lot younger, coming out of the back of that, probably had a bit more energy, and it felt like I was on a par with the parents in terms of age. And now I feel like, as I'm approaching 50 this year, that I'm feeling a little bit more grandfatherly, maybe. And I was in the UK last year, and I've always been relatively active and outdoorsy. And I was with my nephew, Ben, who's one of my oldest nephew. Also, we're both Bens. We were both climbing a tree together, and he was naturally just beating me hands down at it and doing things which I wouldn't dare to do. And I thought, 10 years ago, I might have done that. But There's that sort of relationship change, but I don't feel so much. I guess things just aren't as close to, I'm not checking myself so much. Maybe I've got past some of the awkwardness at the beginning, but also I'm not so protective of my emotions around it as well. So I was surprised when I went to this birthday party recently, because that really kind of hit me at the time when because I haven't been holding the checks of my emotions so much over the last few years. It just, it kind of surprised me. But I think I held those checks a lot more in the early days, and that probably had made a difference to some of the relationships.
Yeah, I really chime with that, actually. It's funny because I've talked about my brother's children, but I haven't talked about my sister-in-law's children. And my child would have fallen right in the middle between my niece and nephew on my brother's side. So I feel more of an affinity with those two children. The only reason I know their ages, and this is a terrible admission to make, I hope he doesn't listen to this, is because I know the age my child would have been. So I project forward and backwards. So I never forget their birthdays, whereas my nephew on my husband's side, I've not connected. And I think there's a little bit of trust in terms of how I turn up in that relationship anyway, but also the fact that that child doesn't correlate with mine, if that makes sense. It's terrible, really. But they are also geographically further away. So I don't feel as connected to that nephew. And I haven't rightly or wrongly invested as much, which is not fair on that child, 100% not fair. But that's kind of the way I see where my child would have sat. And so I really see a difference in the quality of the relationships I have with those children. Nothing wrong with my little nephew on Jim's side, but we just haven't connected. I also struggle with little boys because mine would have been a boy. So I know that there's some of my grief playing out in that relationship as well. So although my grief is moving further away, I still struggle with that little boy and connecting with him. So I think it plays out in different ways in answer to that question. A lot of it relates to how we're sitting with our own stuff, just from my own personal point of view.
I'd say the same with...
Sorry, I was just going to reflect on some of that, which made me think it's also, I guess, not just where I'm at on my journey that has an impact on the relationships, but also what I've found is some of the relationships have an impact on my journey as well. And you mentioned there, Sarah, about, sometimes it's a bit more challenging with boys, because that's what you would have had. And when we were going through IVF and before IVF, when we were planning families, Joe and I, I'd been very set on I really wanted a boy. And after IVF, I was missing not having a boy, And I think as I've gone through my journey, and I've had interactions in surrogate families, with godchildren, nieces, I've really changed my perspective, and the grief has moved towards not having a daughter, which is a really interesting thing for me to, think about on my journey. It's just, can't do anything about it, of course, but it's just that perspective has changed.
Yeah, I've certainly been mistaken for being one of my goddaughters, her mother, when we were out once, and that took me a very long time to get over, a really long time to get over. And she was older then, I'd say probably 5 or 6. And that kind of investing in a relationship, also, as you say, Sarah, that where our grief sits as well and how that shapes us. And that made me back off a lot, because then I started to worry about my attachments, just other stuff that we've got in common. And I had to really just okay, I need to back right away from this relationship, because I'm feeling like I was since every time that I sort of left that space, I was very, very tearful, not because of childlessness, but because actually I think it was the saying goodbye, because I think it was, that blurring of the boundaries there by someone who innocently said something. We are nothing alike. She's nothing. We don't look alike. She's obviously got 2 very lovely mother and father. It was just the fact that it's that assumption that when we went out that I was actually some form of guardian to her. And yes, I was, I suppose. And that stopped me doing that, because it really hit the grief right there. And then having to maintain a sense of kind of it's okay, everything's fine, let's move on, in front of a child is really hard, I think. And maybe that's just, another kind of observation about this is that obviously you're all around children more, but I guess those pockets of grief when they come up and having to manage that in front of your nieces and nephews and the children in your life, that's also quite hard, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, if I add to this, I wouldn't. I'm listening to you as you speak and thinking about the experiences Vicky and I have had, and I don't think for us it's been about different stages of our grief. I think it's more sits around, as I think Ben was talking about, it's the people. We've got two very good examples in our family where we've been open with everyone. And one person in our family took offence to the fact that we wouldn't go to birthday parties, just like you, Ben. That has been a boundary with us for a very, very long time. We were very open about why, and it didn't matter. So we don't have a very deep relationship, let's say, with that part of our family. Whereas, I've just been talking about our nephew sitting with us now, and he's my sister's child as well as his sister, and we have a much better relationship with them because my sister was more inclusive of us, and so, but not pushy. Just take it as it comes, see how it develops, and that has been much more beautiful thing for us. And so, yeah, I'll ramble, but for us, it's about the people and about how we are included rather than stages of life, because we've got examples of many different stages of life with nieces and nephews.
I think that's a really good point, isn't it? We're kind of circling back to that trust, aren't we, in terms of can we trust those people to be careful but also considerate of the fact that we're being around children, we may feel awkward. I know my sister-in-law, is very focused on her child, and that's absolutely 100% the right thing, but me going into a soft play area, that's just not going to happen. So when she sort of makes these arrangements, it's very about her child, which is correct, but there's no real space for me to go, hey, listen, I can't be in a soft play area. That is just too much for me. And there isn't really that trust that I would be okay to say that. So I sort of back away out of that dynamic because it's just too awkward, I think. But it's such an important thing, isn't it? Having the trust that they're open to us being okay in that environment or not okay.
I was really struck, Michael, in your comments, reflecting back on, I know Ben said earlier that actually maybe quite early on in that IVF journey, drew in and sort of were very selective about who do we share this journey with and that kind of stuff. And I was really struck by those friends who had to navigate that sort of infertility news, doing exactly the same thing and finding it a real struggle, going back to your point, Michael, that you could totally do that within sort of friendships and those kind of dynamics, but actually having some really difficult conversations and reactions from family, and it being much more difficult to then be able to kind of draw those boundaries within the family unit, depending on people's ability to kind of be understanding and sympathetic to that situation. And so, Michael, I was really struck when you said that's exactly what you've had to do, is kind of even within family networks, draw different boundaries, as well as kind of recognising those friends and other connections that are the right people and the right relationships to have in on your journey and your processing.
Yeah, it's definitely not an easy thing to do, but for the good of us, it was the right thing to do. All right.
You're on mute.
Shall we call it a day?
We've got another question actually in the chat, if that's okay. Yeah, that just came through, and it was actually from somebody who asked, who's a listener to the podcast, who said that they are a parent and they wanted to ask their friend, whose child is not by choice, to be a godparent. And how do they do that? What's the most sensitive way? I just wanted to ask, how were you asked? Were you formally asked? Was it just something that was in conversation? How were you asked? Because I was never asked. It just was an assumed thing. I just want to say it was just assumed that I would. And I know that when they were young, it was just kind of a natural kind of thing. And maybe because I was first at the hospital. I don't know why. It just was. It was organic, I think, to quote your words, Ben, an organic thing. But I'm just wondering, for the benefit of this person who wanted to ask, how did it happen for you?
From my side, there were couple of two sets of godchildren. One set is based in, of the two, there's other godchildren, but of the two that I'm going to mention, one family is based in the UK and one family is based in New Zealand, and that family used to be based in the UK first. We were incredibly close with the parents anyway. Both of the parents are younger than us, so They were part of a friendship group that Joe and I were probably seen as slightly, more sort of, further on in our lives. And we were going through IVF at the same time that some of those children were born. No, actually, it was the children were born afterwards. So they'd gone through some of the journey with us. They'd seen that. I think it was just that we were very close to those couples anyway, because they knew our journey. They've been part of the journey. It was a formal question. I think it may have come in. I can't remember if it was writing or whether they'd mentioned it to us in person at the time. I think it might have been in writing from both sides. We'd really love it if you would be godparents. And I think they probably, because they knew us, got a sense of what that would mean to us ahead of the time. So obviously you receive that in email or text or whatever, and there's tears, and it does mean a lot, and so that was one way with the official godchildren. But there's also been, good friends where we've been included in their families. One I've mentioned, we've known for years, even before our IVF journey. We were naturally looking after their children, having dinner, putting their kids to bed, etc. They've now grown up. And there was another family when we came to Australia. We moved from London to Sydney, and it's a big adventure. I've told this many times, but we came over with 2 suitcases each. We rented our home out in London. We downsized to just the 2 suitcases, didn't have any jobs lined up, didn't know anybody in Australia at all. One-way tickets over to Sydney. And we landed on the ground. We were picked up at the airport by a friend of a friend who took us, I think it was an hour and a half's drive just out of Sydney to where he was living, where they were living. And we were basically, they put us up for as long as we wanted. They said, you can stay here as long as you wanted. And I've always called it a karmic twist of fate that they had 5 kids, ranging from 2 till 10, and they were all homeschooled. And so whilst Joe and I were looking for jobs, we were also getting engaged with homeschooling and messing about in the pool and things like that. And they pretty quickly just said, you'll be known as Uncle Ben and Auntie Jo, within our family. And we still see them, 11 years from that date on. And, they're very much, we're very much part of their family. And yeah, it's a very close relationship. But that was just, they got us. It was just, there was something where they got us and they just said, we'd like you to be uncle and auntie in our family. Definitely, I think it adds on to the whole thing of the trust from the beginning, and having that trust up front. I think if you don't feel you've got that trust there, you're going to have to be fairly careful why. Well, firstly, why you want them to be godparents, and then how you broach that if the trust isn't there. But I think it's got to come out of friendship, really.
Just when you're saying there, Ben, about sort of the reasons why, I was also conscious that I think the term godparent can be interpreted in very, very different ways, and I think it's helpful to have real clarity about, well, what do you mean when you want to ask someone to be a godparent? Obviously, there were sort of historic kind of religious connotations with it. There are also some sort of perceived, perhaps kind of legal, or if I say yes, does that mean that should X eventuality come about, this means I'm going to then be the sole carer? So I think, one, it's really helpful to have just a bit of clarity about what you mean by the term godparent, because it can mean very different things to different people. And I think, as we sort of spoke about earlier, if the relationship allows, I think I would advocate for just being very transparent and saying, hey, I was wanting to ask you whether you would like to be godparent to this child, but I want to check in with you first whether that is something that actually would be kind of okay with you or helpful or unhelpful. And so rather than kind of going in with the initial question of, will you be the godparent, is almost having that pre-conversation saying, would it be okay to ask you, kind of thing. And I think that is way more accessible for that person and shows how much they value that friendship to kind of be aware of the nuance of that and the difficulties in that. So I think I would definitely advocate for that as well.
That's a really good point, actually. Yeah. What does... we talk about family and that word being diverse. Godparent can be a really kind of diverse, sometimes a bit of a loaded word, I think, as well. And working out what that is and that kind of, that pre-conversation. And if you don't know them, perhaps you don't have that intricate level of friendship, perhaps is maybe some of the experiences we've got here too. Yeah, it's a complicated one. And also I think probably not being offended if the answer is no.
Yes.
That's, it's a question and people are allowed to say no.
Yes.
or they need time to think about it as well, because it is a big ask, I think, with all the emotions that come with it. And that's, again, goes back to trust again, doesn't it? Yeah, that seems to be the key word of this entire podcast episode is trust. It really matters.
And I think as well that trust and relation. Again, we've talked a lot about relationships. I also recognise it's okay to say, I might say yes to being godparent to a child or family, and I'm equally valid to say no to this other one, just because someone is already a godparent, again, doesn't compel them to say yes when you ask them on this occasion. So I think it's also recognising that,
100%.
The fact that might already be a godparent doesn't then automatically mean they're going to say yes to your request.
Absolutely, and what the role entails. I do know of a friend of mine who is childless, not by choice, who is a godparent and was very pleased about this, was very happy about it, and everything was fine. She did some babysitting and things like that, and then they had another child, and could she be the godparent again? And because she'd been so generous to the other one, and she said, I'm not made of money. There's a myth, the whole childless myth of having endless resources to spare. And she said, I don't, so it has to be, that's fine. You have other people you can ask, but I can't keep investing in that way, because she felt that she was being taken advantage of as well. So I think, getting those boundaries right and what godparenting means. Certainly for me, there's no way I could have done the church thing. Partly sort of my beliefs, but also I think there's a publicness about it if it was something religious as well. And that's probably too hard for me. So knowing our own boundaries as well, I think, is important. And
do you want the job
trust? What's the job description here, please? Am I on notice period, and may I hand in my resignation if they get to be awful, horrible teenagers that I don't like anymore, or whatever, or get a bit too kind of fans of Taylor Swift or something? It's not my level of music. I wouldn't know how to associate to that. So there you go.
Thanks for listening. And if you want to find out more about the Full Stop, or want us to take a deeper dive into a topic, then head over to www.thefullstoppod.com, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter, check out the show notes, resources, and join our online community to carry on the conversation, or you may even find some new friendships in there. And as always, it's important for us to let you know you are not alone.
Thank you so much to meet you both. I'm just intrigued by the two suitcases at the airport.
It was a big adventure.
If you don't know him, then I think, what's the chap's name that's the adventurer we've had on before, who just goes off around the world and does all the running and the racing in one of our previous podcasts? Rob, he's amazing, because he just literally just adventures across the world. In this very nomadic life. Has written a book called Downriver Nomad. Really, really interesting read. Just literally just turns up. He just turns up in places and just does crazy things. Has been through quite an epic journey as well. But I think we get on really well.
That's kind of my wannabe life.